Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your host, Coach Jason Koop, and this episode of the podcast is all about lessons learned from Nike's Breaking2 project. On the podcast today, Brad Wilkins, PhD, who is the founder of the Nike Plus Sport Performance Laboratory, as well as the head of the Nike Breaking2 project. And I realize that a lot of the listeners out there are going to be familiar with Nike's Breaking2 project. It created a lot of drama and controversy in the running world, and I want to focus on none of that. What I want to focus on is the listeners. I want you all to take something from the lessons learned from Nike's Breaking2 project that you can apply to your training. And make no doubt about it, a lot of times when we have these types of projects that are solely focused on elite athletes, there are things that are relatable and translatable to all different types of athletes. And I think Nike's Breaking2 project was one of them, irrespective of what you think about the whole spectacle of things. So I hope you guys that are listening out there today get something from this conversation. I had a lot of fun with it, and we're going to get right into it. Here's my conversation with Brad Wilkins, PhD, all about lessons learned from Nike's Breaking2. I want to kind of go back to your Breaking2 experience, which we talked a little bit about within our coaching group. But I think to broaden the discussion out and probably to like introduce the listeners to kind of who you are, why don't you just very briefly go over what your role was with that project and like kind of how you were involved at all the various steps?
Yeah, so I directed the scientific portion of the project in its entirety. And so I was responsible for putting together the team. I built the team, brought people in that were external to Nike, as well as built the team within Nike. And then with that team, organized the overall strategy, how we were going to go after this, and then implemented that strategy. So I was the director of basically the whole scientific portion of this. And so it was a good 3.5 to 4 years of my life of kind of putting this thing together from the ground up to the actual execution on the day. And so people, I guess the public sees like this year-long buildup, but for us, it was several years before that. And so, putting together this team and in a leadership role, and also being able to be involved in the execution on the ground on the day and the day-to-day stuff was quite rewarding. One of the, probably the most rewarding experience in my career so far, outside of some collegiate things and getting my PhD and those kinds of more personal stuff. But as far as, things that I've done in my career, was one of the most rewarding for sure.
And so how did that work? Did Nike come to you? Did they put out like an RFP and say, we need somebody to like spearhead this massive project that, there's a 90% failure rate probably associated with it? How did that work?
We failed at that one, right?
Yeah, right.
But so no, I was at Nike at the time, and I was directing a lab, what we call Nike Plus, the Sport Performance Lab, which was doing a lot of work on modeling performance. We were doing a lot of mathematical modeling that put data into Nike's digital electronics products. And out of that work, we had a lot of predictive models and things like that. And we're working with external partners that had a lot of predictive models. So as this discussion of, hey, what if Nike could go after this big concept of breaking a 2-hour marathon, I was involved in some of those initial discussions, and I was able to go into these meetings saying, hey, look, this is physiologically possible. And we have the math that says that this is physiologically possible. We can collect the data and understand if we can find a human that can do this, and kind of bring in all the different scientific components to them and say, like, this is possible. This is how we would do it if we had the capability or the possibility of going after this. And so they said, sure, let's try it. And that was kind of the beginning, right? And so we were like, okay, let's go after this. And so we set some gates and we set some strategic planning to be able to go after this step by step. And so that's really how it started. There was a few people, including a guy by the name of Sandy Bodecker, who had been at Nike for a very long time. He had a lot of administrative kind of pull within the company. And so having his voice was very important. My boss at the time, Matt Nurse, who's the VP of the Nike Sport Research Lab, he was a big proponent of it. And so when I came in and our team came in with this plan, then those voices collectively were able to kind of push it through the company, and it progressed slowly at first through the process, I guess, of if you can call it a process, of how these things get done at a company like Nike.
But from your perspective, this was like not so much of an athlete driven initiative, but almost like a scientist and a company driven initiative where, we can even go back to the mid 80s, right? When Dr. Michael Joyner kind of put some of the original math together and said, yeah, this is, 158, whatever is possible. But from your description, it's a bunch of people in a room, scientists, biomechanists, physiologists, and things like that, saying, hey, this is possible. Let's go find the right athlete, put them with the right technology, give them the right conditions, and let's see if it's possible.
That's exactly it. So a little bit of background. Mike Joyner was my mentor for my postdoctoral fellowship. So I know Mike quite well, and know of his work and his predictions. And so part of what we did was taking those models that he developed in the 90s and added to it the last 20 years of knowledge that we've gained. And absolutely, yeah, it's a bunch of people in a room saying, like, the science is there. Let's go see if we set all the context and we are able to set the conditions and do all those things that you just described. Is this, let's take it from the page of a published journal and see if we can do it in real life. That literally what it was. And it started with, just like you said, let's go find the athletes. So that was phase one, was let's go test a bunch of athletes and see if they have the physiology based on these models, and see if we can find that person.
And what did that pool look like? Because it ended up being 3 people. How did it start though?
We have data on, I think, 18 very, very good runners, obviously. Because this was a Nike project, we had to stick with the Nike pool of athletes. And so we were criticized for that, and I get that criticism. But that's just the nature of the beast. And so yeah, anywhere from young, really good 5K, 10K folks that may have not done a marathon even. And so do they have that physiology and maybe don't have that mental baggage that comes with running a marathon? And all the way to Elliot and Cersei and those folks who were much more established. And so we worked with managers and with other folks from these athletes teams and got them to come in to do a bunch of testing, and looked for these physiological characteristics that we felt were the most important, just to kind of define that person.
And from my understanding, it was a constellation of those physical characteristics. It wasn't just like one or two. Like, you had a team of people, not just you or one other physiologist. You had a team of people looking at several different things and saying, okay, this person's got a whole lot of A, a whole lot of B, a whole lot of C, maybe a little bit of D, all the way down the alphabet. athlete 2 has different shades of all of those different flavors, athlete 3, blah, 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 blah. And then you're collectively coming to like a human decision, like, okay, we're going to pick these 3 people.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So if you go back to Mike Joyner's original models, it was maximal oxygen consumption. So work capacity, max VO2. It was the ability to sustain a certain pace for a long period of time. In the 90s, they talked about that as the lactate threshold. Now we know it's more like a lactate turn point, or what we call a critical power, critical velocity, in critical velocity in running. And the final one is running economy. So how much energy does it require you to run at a given speed for a long distance? So that's kind of what those original models were built off of. Then we also looked at things like just what was the athlete's willingness to go after this big idea? If they were hesitant, if they didn't really want to just jump in and say, yeah, let's go for it. And then those kinds of things came into our minds too. And then there were some other physiological variables, physiological characteristics. We did some work in the chamber, like what was their sweat rate, things like that. That was less to make the decision, but more to understand how much fluid they're going to lose and things like that. So we did really focus on those 3 main characteristics. And then these other ideas that were a little bit more squishy, that were, does this person just have that mindset? And the good example is one time we put zirconated essay on the treadmill, and we wanted to collect some oxygen uptake data. So how much oxygen is he's consuming? And we wanted to put him at 21.1 miles an hour, because that's the speed that he would have to run a 2-hour marathon, right? And so we said, hey, it was early in his training, early on in the whole program. So we said, hey, would you be willing to get on here? And we want to collect some data. And the first thing that he said was, how long do you want me to run? It wasn't, oh, no, that's too fast. It's still early in my training. It's just like, how long? How do you want me to run for 10 minutes, half an hour? Like, we're just like, oh no, just like 6 minutes or so. But that's an example of the mindset of like, how long do you want me to run for?
Yeah.
There wasn't any questioning. There wasn't any, hesitation. It was just, yeah, I'll run that fast. How long do you want me to run for?
The next thing I want to get into is one of the things that I felt was, you just mentioned the athlete, right? The athlete's willingness is extremely important. And one of the very unfortunate things that I thought that got lost out of that whole initial project was the athletes, because so much focus got put on the shoes. When did the shoes actually come into the mix? Because you mentioned this was a long process, 3 or 4 years. Athletes came into it a little bit later, but a group of people getting together in a think tank, was kind of the first part of it. And obviously running economy, out of all those variables that you mentioned, that ended up being kind of the hero variable that you were able to influence the most, that you and your team was able to influence the most. When did the shoes start to come into the mix? And was there like a light bulb that went off that said, now we've got it. We've got something that affects this to a certain degree to which it seems more plausible?
So yeah, it didn't really happen that way. So going back a little bit, so I mentioned that I was involved in some of these early discussions around, hey, what if we were to go after this big idea of breaking a 2-hour marathon? There wasn't any shoe discussion in those meetings at that time. And at the same time, there was discussions around, hey, what if we could build a shoe that could reduce running economy that would allow somebody to run a 2-hour marathon? So these were initially very different discussions. I was involved in, hey, what if we could set the conditions independent of a shoe for Nike to go after this? One of the reasons why at a company like Nike, this was able to happen is because these 2 conversations converged, where this group of people that was building a shoe came together with this group of people that was thinking about, hey, let's set the conditions to do this. And now Nike has this great story of a product that's involved in this large initiative that, going after this big idea. So that's how it kind of came together, and the shoe came together with this larger concept of running a 2-hour marathon. So running economy obviously is a very important variable in an athlete's or runner's ability to run fast for long distances. And so a lot of things can affect running economy. Wind resistance can affect running economy, especially at those speeds. We're talking about, 21K an hour, right? So it's there at those speeds, wind resistance can have a big effect. So can running a really sharp turn, running up a hill. All these things are obviously going to increase the energetic costs to run at the same speed. And your equipment, your footwear can definitely affect that as well. So my team looked at the problem of, let's put all these things together: wind resistance, running sharp corners, making sure the course is flat, and the shoe. And how does that collectively decrease the energetic cost to run at 21.1 kilometers an hour? So that's how we approached it. But then you also had this team that was focused on that hero part of the shoe that was contributing to this greater picture of reducing running economy. And Nike, being a shoe company, is going to make that the hero, right? That's, one could argue if that's good or bad, but I would argue that this project would have never happened if that didn't happen, because a company like Nike is probably not going to get around, or get behind it if that value return wasn't necessarily there. That might be harsh, but you get where I'm coming from.
Totally.
And so it was really this kind of bringing these two big ideas together. And I'll agree that at the end of it, both from a criticism standpoint as well as this was the reason why it was done, the shoe became this hero. But it was a collection of everything, the athlete being the most important piece of that puzzle. And then everything else we did as far as controlling the conditions as much as possible, making sure that they weren't running tight corners, blocking wind resistance with pacers in front of them. Those factors collectively is what got us so close in that attempt, and what enabled Elliot to eventually do it.
Yeah. And I go back to my original proposition with that question was that there's an athlete at the end of the day that still has to run that fast. Doesn't matter what they've got on their feet. They're running barefoot, running around corners, not running around corners, whatever. You still have to have an athlete at the end of the day that's physically and mentally capable of producing such an effort.
You're absolutely right. And there's a part, I think it's in the documentary, the National Geographic documentary, right before we're about to go do this attempt, right? And they have me saying literally that, like, we can be criticized as much as people want to criticize us, but at the end of the day, a human has to run 21.1 kilometers an hour for 42.195 kilometers, for this to happen. We're not pushing or pulling them. Like, they physically have to do it.
Yeah. In this constellation of the fact that the event itself was unlike anything that the running world has really ever seen before, in terms of the nature of all of the different things that you all were trying to deliberately contrive to create this extremely conducive environment, combined with Nike and all of the baggage, rightful or not, that comes along with Nike, and the spectacle around it, had this like weird just concoction of things that was just kind of ripe for criticism. But I don't want to kind of focus on that, because I know you've been through that, and I don't like to beat up the scientists about this kind of stuff, because that's not your role,
I'll make a quick comment about it. It seemed contrived, and literally was contrived. Like that was the whole point.
Yeah.
Was answering the question, is a human capable of running, 42.195 kilometers in under 2 hours? That was the question. That was what we were trying to see. And we broke a couple of traditional marathon rules to be able to do that. But that was literally what we were trying to go after. Now there's a lot of baggage and packaging that had to happen around that.
Totally.
But that was our intent and our real purpose.
Well, and what I want to start to drill down to, which is another area of expertise of yours, is what's translatable for everybody. Because it's not like, okay, people can watch this and get inspired. And absolutely that happened.
Yeah.
There's a lot of product innovation in footwear and in nutrition and in other areas that starts with the top down. They look at, here's how we're going to make Eliud Kipchoge a few % faster in order to do this amazing thing, or whatever other athlete that you're looking at. And sometimes those techniques and products are relatable to the general public, and oftentimes they're just not. But I think in either one of those cases, there's something pushing the product down to everybody else, whether it's for economic gain or whatever the other motivations are. You guys had the specific aim of enabling this athlete to attempt to break a 2-hour marathon. But if you take off the Nike hat and just put on like everyday athlete hat, what's translatable in those situations to the everyday athlete? Somebody that's going out, they're going to run the Boston Marathon in 3.5 hours. They're going to run an ultra marathon in 24 hours. Like, how do we take those things and make them relatable to the average person?
Yeah, specifically from Breaking2, outside of the footwear. And I took my Nike hat off a couple of years ago, so I have no problem. And one of the things I think that people miss that can become crucial is just really clear and focused planning. So we did that. We set the context for what would enable this 2-hour marathon. But you also, if you have no control over the context specifically, you can still plan and control as much as you can. Like my hydration strategy, my nutrition strategy for all of that, knowing what the average temperatures are in Boston during the Boston Marathon, knowing what your how much water you're going to lose. That's a really easy number to get. You take your body weight before you train and your body weight after each training run, and that is exactly how much. Almost some percentages off, but for the most part, that's how much water you need to stay hydrated during the marathon. So just knowing exactly what all those numbers are and going in with a really clear plan, from a pacing strategy to a hydration strategy to what's the temperature, and adjusting for all of those little things, that can be super powerful. And if nothing else, just giving the confidence that I have this plan going in. And I think that is underappreciated, to be able to have this context as controlled as possible when you're going into these things. In some cases, you do have more control. Like, you can pick a race. If you run a PR marathon, you want to run the longest 24 hours in an ultra, those kinds of things. You can pick something that has more optimal average temperatures, that has a course that is conducive to your running style, has some things that are going to give you the benefit. So, going up Heartbreak Hill in Boston for some people is not conducive to their fastest marathon. So picking something that's, if your goal is to run your fastest possible marathon, I get going to Boston school, but that might not be the place that is going to happen. So where can you find something that allows you to have a little bit more control? So those are things that I learned from Breaking2 that I think are very transferable or translatable, that people don't necessarily appreciate so much. Another part of that question is that I think is important is that sometimes it's harder to change small percentage points in the elite athletes than it is for an everyday or more average runner. Meaning that what it takes for me to change 0.5% in Elliott, that could be 3% or 5% in somebody who doesn't have as much room to change as Elliott. Elliott doesn't have that much room to change, right? Where an average runner has a lot more room to change. So the impact can actually be significantly greater in some of these manipulations. I'm not saying the shoe or something like that really is 5% in an average versus 3% in Elliott, but there are factors that are easier to change because there's just so much more room to change for somebody who's more of an average athlete. Other variables, it's more difficult, but there are a lot of things, training responses, dose response from a load standpoint, that you actually could get higher outcomes in somebody who is less elite than say Elliott is.
Yeah, we always have to remember that when we're reading literature in sports science and evaluating how valuable the intervention was, particularly related to who the cohort of people are that they were actually studying. If it's a recreational, untrained group, yeah, they should get 10 or 15% improvement from whatever intervention that you did. If it's an elite cohort and they got 1%, you better be doing a backflip over what you just did.
Absolutely agree. And people, even within a study, like looking at what that percentage change is due to an intervention, you have to take into account where they start.
Right.
If they start at a very different level, then that delta change could be very, very different. It depends on the variable though. So if you look at something like sodium bicarbonate as a ergogenic aid, that actually, it seems to help more elite athletes better than it helps, at least from an acute performance standpoint, the more average everyday athletes, because those elite athletes can push themselves hard enough to be able to produce the hydrogen ion that needs to be buffered by that ergogenic aid, where an average runner may not really need that increased buffering because they're not working hard enough to require that amount of buffering the hydrogen ion. So it depends on the variable, but the point's absolutely taken. It just depends on where they start.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you also mentioned the planning piece of it from Breaking2, and I also remember watching the Ineos 159 project. Both of those documentaries, when I looked at that through my coaching lens, the biggest thing that I came away with was, yeah, we need to put a lot more time into planning out all of these variables. They might not all be meaningful at the end of the day, or they might not be meaningful to the same extent at the end of the day, but we can look at all of them and say, okay, these are the 5 or 6 or 8 or however many things that we actually want to focus on. That shouldn't be an excuse to go through the entire inventory from the get-go. And I'm guessing, just by watching that there's 3 or 4 or 5 times more things behind the scenes that you were checking the boxes on that didn't even make it to the documentary.
Absolutely. So there's 2 kind of answers to that question or comments to that. So we look at things from 80% of the impact can come from 20% of the variables kind of perspective, meaning if we just focus on these 20%, then we can have this massive gain, right? So we absolutely did just say these 5 things are the most important. We have to nail those. Those are critical. Yes, there are 20 things that we would love to be able to control, but if we control number 18 and don't control number 2, this thing's gonna fail. But if we control these 5, these over here, yes, we would love to have them work great, but less important than these critical factors, because we knew we could get 80% of the way there just from these 5 variables. So you're absolutely right in going in and say, what are those 4 or 5 critical things? Even for somebody just starting out, what are those 2 or 3 critical things that I have to nail, I have to get right for me to hit my goal? Spend 80% of your time on those 20% of things. Yes, and then there's other things that can cause disruption, but not necessarily critical to success. And so we definitely approach this problem from that standpoint, because there's a long list of things that we could go on forever of checking boxes.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
These 5, we said critical. So, and just worked really hard to solve those.
So we've gone through this like kind of revolution in footwear technology, especially when it comes to road running. And although the primary audience for this podcast are going to be trail and ultra runners, I think there's some lessons learned. What's going to come next in endurance sports? Because these seem to kind of like go through waves. You can remember, 10 years ago where even carbohydrate supplementation wasn't really all that well understood, I guess is the best way to put it. And now it's de facto. So now we're starting to see better shoe technology across all of the different brands and really focusing on how they can improve running economy. What do you think, like when you put that, what's next hat on, what do you think is next down the line?
I don't know. You're right. There's been a lot of advances in nutrition, and I wouldn't say advances more so than just understanding and application, like translation of what scientists have known for a while. And I think a big part of that too is looking at periodization of nutrition. So being able to stress different parts of the biochemical pathways, metabolism, at different times. That's interesting kind of trend or progression that I think is starting to happen now, similar to what we've been doing with periodization of training for the last 50 plus years. And so there's that. I really think that, there's a big data push right now.
Right.
That's been progressing over the last 5 to 10 years. I think that it's happening a little wrong, meaning that most of the companies that are building systems or building platforms or even building devices are going after the masses. And even when they're asking questions like, how are these populations behaving, using the term big data? For an individual, that means a lot less. What the individual needs is, how do I respond and behave in this context of the world for me to optimize my performance? So it's a lot of little data, meaning I'm just more data that's individualized for me. That allows me to describe the context of how I respond to my environment, to my thinking, to everything around me to perform optimally. So I think that that's some low-hanging fruit for data companies or other for people to start thinking of, hey, I want to collect these data, but I need to do it from the perspective of how do I respond, not, trying to ask questions about how the population responds to different things. And so, because, how do I respond to heat stress? How do I respond to a given training dose or load? How long does it take to recover from that training load? That allows me to personalize and optimize for me. And I think that there's some low-hanging fruit right there that could actually take some pretty big leaps and bounds for people individually to have some pretty big gains. Just because, again, it's kind of controlling this context, right? But understanding me and how I respond in these specific environments and situations that could allow me to take these big leaps forward. And that includes nutrition and cooling and some of these other kinds of more technical kind of approaches. But if you're just taking some nutrition plan and you have no idea how you respond or how that impacts your specific performance, then it almost doesn't mean anything. So the more you can manipulate and apply it specific for you is going to be the biggest impact.
I completely agree with you that we're approaching a lot of that problem backwards. And I've got two examples of where we've like corrected that and where I think we need to correct it. So where we've corrected it, in my opinion, is altitude. So it wasn't that long ago where the altitude was like one of the de facto ways to train, and we underappreciated the individual responses to altitude. And we had this blanket recommendation: okay, you're going to go up to 8,000 feet, you're going to live at 8,000 feet, and then you're going to drop down to 3,000 feet and train there. And while that is still used to a great extent amongst a lot of athletes, we're definitely a lot more choosy with which athletes we actually use. We have them go through, some sort of battery of tests pre-altitude exposure. We monitor them during, and if they have a good experience, we'll repeat it. And if they don't have a good experience, they might change something or not repeat it. But those are like lessons learned from, we had all this data from a population level to say that live high, train low works, but we took it down to the level of the individual and kind of customized how we implemented it. Where we haven't learned that lesson, and this is the best example I can come up with this off the top of my head, is with blood biomarkers, where we'll take a blood draw from an athlete and we'll compare it to a reference range of a healthy population, which is insane. Like that proposition of saying, okay, I want this elite athlete to go in, get their blood drawn. We're going to run a whole battery of tests. We're going to take 3 tubes of blood. We're going to find out everything, cortisol levels, vitamin D, you kind of name it. And we're going to compare that one single athlete to a reference range of healthy people that's comprised of healthy people is absolutely bonkers to me.
Yeah. So, because it means nothing until you understand how that impacts you individually.
Right.
Just because you have a reference value that might be considered a little low in vitamin D, like that you could be at the high end of your, response curve to that concentration of vitamin D. I mean, that might be a bad example, but yeah, so you have to measure outcome variables and link them back, and not just correlation, but cause and effect to these changes in blood markers. So there's outcome variables that are performance related or highly performance predictive that has to come from cause and effect from those blood biomarkers. And there hasn't been the studies to really do that on a population level, I would argue, let alone at the individual level so much, right? Because you're right, the reference values are unknown. And I'll agree with the altitude example. 20 years ago, from a population basis, we grouped people into responders and non-responders.
100%. I totally remember that.
And now we know, well, we've done a lot of work on this, and is that just because you're a non-responder once doesn't mean you won't be a responder the next time you go up. And just because you're a responder once doesn't mean you're going to respond every single time you do a live high, train low kind of protocol. So understanding how an individual responds in a specific context in a given period of time, based on baseline data, based on where they start, based on what their training responses are looking like. There's a lot of different things that will impact whether or not somebody, quote unquote, responds to altitude. By the way, with one marker, and that's an increase in hemoglobin concentration. So there's a lot of other markers, buffering capacity, that, other kinds of things, blood volume changes that could be happening at altitude that could be either beneficial or detrimental to somebody's ultimate performance. So understanding the interaction and the integration of these different variables is something we're just kind of getting to.
Yeah. And I've said this on previous podcasts before, the whole altitude thing has always kind of miffed me, because one of the things that's underappreciated about most of those study designs is the athlete's training is incredibly controlled during the altitude intervention. It's if you're not like equating for that somehow, like just doing the same training intervention, the same environment with the same people, the same time of year, it's like, well, all of those things could just be affected by better training.
Absolutely. And I would argue that the training is not individualized in those studies,
100%.
meaning that you're going to have people that are responding or not responding to a given load very differently, based on their individual response. So you just don't know if they were a non-responder to the training, not a non-responder to the altitude. So those are all important things. And it gets back to this idea of response of the individual and understanding that better.
So here's the $1 zillion question, right? If we can solve this today, you and I, we can go into business tomorrow and we can sell it to all of the athletes. What are the things that you would look for to create those individual responses? Is it like a phenotype, like fiber type distribution? Is it a certain genotype? Is it looking at the training response, the previous training responses to things? Is it looking at some other physiological property of the athlete? Like, what is it? Like, how can you actually individualize those things?
That is the $1 zillion question. If I'd figured that out, I would be in business for myself. So it's all of the above. So the way I think about this is that you have the athlete in the center, right? If you think of expanding circles, the athlete is in the center. There are primary variables that are associated with a performance, an acute performance on that day. Things that we talked about during Breaking2 are probably some of those primary variables for endurance sports: maximum oxygen consumption, running economy, sustained running. Those are some of the, as well as some cognitive motivation variables that are primary. Then there are, the next circle out are secondary variables, things like how hot it is. Are you at altitude? Other kind of biomechanic variables that actually impact running economy. Those are secondary variables, and you can spread that out to tertiary and quaternary variables. And who knows how far out these circles go, of things that are interacting in different ways to impact these primary variables. And so first thing we need to do is define those primary variables for each specific context that you're going to perform in. In endurance performance, you can probably define them quite well. And then you have to define what's secondary, tertiary, et cetera. And then you have to understand the data, how all those things interact to ultimately dictate the impact on these primary variables, right? So we have to nail the primary variables first. I think we're getting close in some ways, in some contexts, but we don't even know how secondary variables always impact those primary variables for a specific individual. So it's going to take data to understand those interactions for that person, not for the population necessarily, because we can do that. Yeah. You can take 1 million people with wearing Garmin devices and you can get that on a population level if you ask that question. It's much, much harder to look at the interaction of those things on those primary variables for each specific individual and allow them to make some behavioral change in their training and their nutrition, all these other factors that might be influencing. So nailing those primary variables would be first, and really understanding them, and then going out circle by circle and looking at how are all these data factors influencing each other and those primary variables. So it's not a very easy problem to solve, but that's how I would approach it.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember when I first started coaching, like I would definitely lean on like what we were just referring to as the population side information more. And now I lean on more of the individual response side. That's just been a big like transformation in my whole coaching career, where first I would say, okay, well, if we were just talking about training volume, right? Just keep it really simple. Here's the training volume that a lot of other people that are using. So I'm going to apply some version of that to the athlete. That's how I would coach 20 years ago when I was 22 years old or whatever. Now I would say, okay, let's look at the individual. How have they trained? Did they respond better to a period of high volume training, low volume training? Okay, here's how we're going to base the training off of that, and then take in as a secondary factor what the population data would say. Mm-hmm. And you could do that across anything. You could do that across nutrition. You could even do that across altitude intervention, like we were just talking about earlier. You could do it across heat intervention, where you can look at the studies and say, okay, well, it's a 6-day protocol. But then you could say, well, how do you do in the heat? Yeah. When it's hot, okay, and how are we going to design a heat acclimation protocol around how you specifically are adapting to the heat? So I just went, and I think that everybody's trying to make a buck. So they're trying to search for like the properties within the athlete that could give those indications. I mean, even across training volume, right? They're trying to find, okay, well, this fiber type distribution, is going to be the thing that high volume athletes have this type of fiber, or athletes that adapt more readily to high volume training have this type of fiber type distribution. Athletes that, adapt more to low volume training have this type of fiber type distribution. But then I look at that and I'm like, that's one variable. Like, why would you base training off of one single thing when there's a whole host of variables kind of going on around it?
That's exactly right. And I think that there's, going back to this primary, secondary, tertiary, like there's a lot of products and there's a lot of people thinking about things that are probably quaternary in how, where it really lies in this, the circle of importance, if you want to call it that. Right. And, so we're selling a product, or we're talking about fiber type distribution. We're talking about, something in the brain that might, influence motivation or something like that. So, those things are, they're further out than really the primary factors that should be fixed first. I'm not saying they're unimportant once you've gotten to that circle, but they're not going to have an impact if you aren't solving those primary variables first. So that's part of the problem, or part of the difficulty, is that we're not necessarily focusing on what we should be focusing on now. And yeah, fiber type distribution from a population standpoint can very well describe somebody's response to training. But I guarantee you, I can find you somebody with a high fast twitch fiber type that's going to respond to a specific load training that you have, that was built for somebody with a high percentage of slow twitch fibers. So just because the population says the distribution is over here doesn't mean I can't find you somebody that's the opposite.
That's the issue that I've always had with those types of diagnostic evaluations that can help drive training, is that I always have a better diagnostic, and that's the previous training. Yeah. In almost every athlete. Like some athletes, I get it. They don't have a training history, and you're gonna guess, and you can bring those things into the mix. But if you have an athlete with training history, you should be able to look back at it and say, okay, well, here's a period of high volume training. Here's where you got injured. Here's a period where you're anemic. Here's a period where you decided to be a vegetarian and it worked or it didn't work or whatever. Like, you've got this huge training history with most adult athletes. And even going back to if they played team sports before they got into running, if we kind of drill it down to the everyday athlete, right, versus the elite athletes, you always have the training history to help inform future practices, whether they're training practices, we were talking about volume earlier, or nutrition practices. Are you going to go on a, this kind of diet or that kind of diet? Like, that should be your first information point. And then bring in, okay, we're going to tweak this, we're going to tweak that. That's the way I've approached it, at least, versus the diagnostic piece saying, you've got XYZ gene, so we're going to take a left turn on your training and do all high intensity training because of this one particular genotype.
Yeah. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. So
please do.
There can be diagnostic information that you can get from understanding genotype, or even some phenotypes like fiber type. But there are so many factors that can influence how a gene is ultimately expressed, or how that expression is changed before some ultimate response happens, even a phenotype. So epigenetics is getting bigger in sports science now. It's like, how just because a gene is expressed, how is that modified through training or through other kinds of stuff, and then ultimately expressing a protein that is, very different from the ultimate or from the beginning, that initial gene expression. So there's a lot of things that can change that along the path, that are environmental, that are training, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't necessarily, looking at fiber type, that's an expression. So that's further down the road. But then there's also how much oxygen is that muscle getting, and how much blood flow is it getting? Is it getting the right, nutrients to be able to turn over ATP at a rate that is required for them to do the work? There's a lot of physiological factors that have nothing to do with that fiber type that ultimately can dictate how well that muscle fiber or that muscle group or that entire muscle, the entire system, is going to ultimately behave and react to a given stimulus. So there's so many different factors that have to be thought of and integrated together that ultimately predict these things. And I would argue we're not even close to really translating all the way from a gene to how somebody's going to perform in a race. That's impossible to do right now, because you just don't have all those expanding circles that describe every influence along that pathway. I will say too, that is going back to how coaches interact with the athletes. My experience has been that the best coaches are the ones who are able to change their thinking and individualize their approach to their athletes. Coaches who may have had an Olympic gold medalist, world marathon champion, whatever, that had that individual, and think that because they applied a certain strategy and dose relationship for loading and all this kind of stuff for that athlete, that it's going to work for everybody else. And that is totally untrue. That's the best way for those coaches to ruin athletes, because dose responses or load responses are very individual. So if you're not able to do what you're talking about and individualize, again, maybe you start with this blanket program, but you have to change it and individualize it for that athlete as you're learning how they're responding. If you don't, then you're just going to be known for that one Olympian and not a large group of Olympians.
I want to dig into this for a little bit, because one of my good friends and former colleagues is a physiologist over at the Olympic Training Center, and I did a podcast with her a few weeks ago. Her name's Lindsay Golich, who's fantastic. And I originally knew Lindsay as a coach. She came in through our coaching system. I was, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ahead of her or something. And I became her. I use this term very loosely, boss, because she was way smarter than I am for years, and she ran our physiology lab. And then she made the transition from being a coach working with athletes to being a physiologist and being on the science side of things and trying to inform athletes and coaches of what's going on physiologically. So she has this really unique perspective of, she's a fantastic coach and has been for many years, but now her role is on the sports science side, which is kind of where you come from, and she has to interface with those coaches and with those athletes. And I've had a lot of just fantastic conversations with her over the years about just what you were alluding to, the coaches that get it and the coaches that don't, that can use sports science to inform what's going on with their athletes. And then some of them completely disregard it. And even in my experience, we've had athletes, I've had this experience now that I'm now thinking about it. We've had athletes from other coaches come into our lab, do standard lactate threshold, VO2 max test, and their coach not even ask for the results because they don't care. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, right, from the sports science perspective, you've seen a lot of these coaches and a lot of these athletes in all these different types of environments. How do they strike the balance between taking information from you and making actionable versus, well, I've already done this and this is kind of what works?
It's really hard. And I haven't had a lot of experience with that. Because I tend to be a little more bullheaded and just well, if you don't want to listen to whatever. But that's not totally, it's more tongue in cheek. But So I'll go back to Breaking2 for just a second, because we, when Zersane and Lalisa and Elliot first signed on to do this project, one of the big goals that we had was to really integrate and get into their system, not to change, but to become partners along the path. So there was a specific intent to understand what their coaches were doing, learn, and have a partnership with their coaches and those athletes throughout the journey. And the reason for that was just what you said, is so that we aren't thought of, or we weren't going to be thought of as, hey, we're the sports scientists, we're going to follow this physiology plan, and you guys are going to change everything because we're smarter than you are. That was not how we wanted to approach this. We wanted to say, hey, let's work together. Why do you do certain things? What do you see in the way that Lisa or Elliot responds? And how can we work with you and maybe give you some information about the science that might help you think? And there was some initial, like, we don't want to listen to you guys. But as that relationship grew, we really found that was the best approach, is that it takes time to trust each other and have that kind of relationship with coaches, so that you can move things forward. And to this day, Nike's, Brett Kirby at Nike is still there. He has these kind of relationships with these coaches and athletes much, much deeper now than it was even when we ran Breaking2, because he's continued these relationships, and they are using his knowledge in the sports science and applying it to the way that they think about things in a much deeper level than they definitely did a couple of years ago. Right. So that's the approach that I've seen work best, but it's not a quick fix. Yeah. It's a deep relationship that you have to build over time. And it sounds like this colleague of yours probably is taking that approach, or that would be my recommendation is to, hey, I don't know everything. You have a lot of hands-on experience with coaching and how these things work. And so how do we start building relationship and work together?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to like an age-old adage that I have with a lot of our coaches, is the best coaches have the best networks, because they're not going to be the smartest in any one single area. There's always things to learn from other people and other experts in an area. And the coaches that I feel always like fall behind the 8 ball are the ones that just like insulate themselves, and they never reach out, or they never branch out, or they don't take advice from other people and stuff like that.
Yeah. And there's definitely things that people are connected to, that, knowledge that they had from their mentor or their boss or their coach, that they're implementing. And they're so ingrained in those concepts that it takes a while to potentially break them out of it. And sometimes you never do, but there's other places that you might be able to start influencing decisions from a sports science standpoint.
Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the prediction business. And if COVID has taught me anything, I'm pretty terrible at the prediction business. So feel free to make some mistakes here. It's totally fine. Nobody's going to hold you to it. We're not going to start a business.
It's going to be on. It's going to be, right?
Yeah, it's exactly. but we're not going to go out and start to seek investor money off of any of this stuff. We're just going to predict for a little while. So we went down this path of the next thing in innovation is going to be the capability of drilling down to the level of the individual. What is it with? Is it with nutrition? Is it with biomechanics? Is it with training? What's the lowest hanging fruit in that whole arena that we'll probably start to see emerge?
Honestly, you may think I'm, sidestepping your question a little bit. But honestly, I think it's really some minor integrations of all of the above. Meaning, if you can just even find small connections between, oxygen consumption, running economy, nutrition, biomechanics, and start to put those together, and even in in the most minor of connections between those things and how they influence ultimate performance outcome, that could be a big thing, because nobody's doing that right now, right? People are saying, I'm only going to change nutrition, or I'm only going to change running economy, or I'm only going to change mechanical factors that influence running economy. So if you are able to even find some minor connections that ultimately describe changes in performance or outcome variables, I think that can be huge. And so those data are being collected right now. There's a lot of systems, Garmin, a lot of the things that have those data, but they're looking at it from a mass standpoint. They're not necessarily really helping the individual make those connections for themselves. They're trying to, but they haven't really cracked that nut yet. So even really minor kind of interactions and influences of these different variables on performance outcomes can be huge. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is it not sidestepping too much?
No, not sidestepping at all, because the thing that comes to mind, which is not a lot of runners or ultra runners are going to be familiar with this system, but we just happen to have some familiarity with it, because I remember seeing this in the early 2000s, and it's still around. Is this system called Omega Wave. And it's used in a lot of like team sports and combat sports, where they have to train an athlete across a lot of different areas of their physiology. They have to train speed and power, and they have to train endurance, and they have to train skill. And what this system was trying to do is to say, okay, you are more tuned in to training skill today, or you're more in tune to training power, or you're more in tune to training endurance, or you need to take a rest day. And it was we're not going to go through the entire system, because that's another podcast. It's going to get way too complicated, and we're going to get into like electricity and AC currents and things like that, DC potential, whatever. But anyway, it was trying to take a host of variables, I'll leave it at that, and alchemize them to a certain extent and say, okay, here's what the population should train at. But I never got a good sense that it would ever use it, or it could drill down to the level of the individual. That was always kind of like left up to the practitioner to interpret, although it would give these stoplight systems across any of these different, training areas that we could see. And that system is still around.
Oh yeah. So the thing that I'm less confident is the predictions of you should do this, you should do that, you should rest. When I say we need to understand the interactions of these variables, it's so that we understand the individual responsiveness, and then over time are not taking the place of the coach, but assisting the coach in individualizing those programs based on those responses. So you got to start with tracking, just like you talked about with understanding history of your athletes. You have to understand how they're responding for a period of time before you're going to be good at predicting at what they necessarily should do. So to come out of the box and say, because your algorithm says this, you should train speed or you should rest, is impossible to do. You need to be able to understand, and maybe it takes a couple of months to this dose response to all these factors, or as many factors as you can, and the integration of them to then be able to say, here's what you should do based on your previous data. We don't know enough about the specific acute response relationships to really make those predictions out of the gates. We have to understand more chronic dose response relationships for each individual to then get to a place where we can actually predict. So that would be my, I guess, kind of summation of those thoughts to some degree. Part of the problem is that humans don't have a very long attention span. So 2 months before you can make a prediction, that's ridiculous. Like, you should be able to do that tomorrow.
Right.
So that's part of the problem, is that we don't necessarily invest as consumers, and definitely companies don't, allowing somebody to have that kind of or requiring somebody to have that kind of investment before they get good at predicting what you should do or not.
So you're now back in academia, and you've got willing grad students and PhD candidates and things like that to conduct this research. What does that look like?
So I'm actually in an undergraduate only institution, but I do have students that are going to be involved in my research, and so just started school. And this is my first year at this university. So what I'm really doing right now is, in this land of COVID, trying to figure out how to build my lab and get the kind of questions asked and answered that I want to go after. And so I'm in the building stages of that, and not pumping out data right now for sure, because we can't even really collect data in the lab. But trying to build that foundation to be able to hit the ground running once we're able to collect data.
But if you had your ideal world, you can take a magic wand and say, okay, let's fast forward 10 years and we built this robust program. Like what is the research that was relating to what we think is coming next, which is the ability to link these variables to outcome performances or training interventions. What's a snapshot of what that looks like? The research to get there, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah. So my big interest from a research standpoint is exactly this: is understanding. I have a background in how the cardiovascular system is controlled. So how does our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, control the cardiovascular system, and in turn influence blood flow during exercise, and how may that limit performance? So my big areas of research are looking at cardiovascular control and blood flow regulation, and how that influences bioenergetics. So how we use energy and get energy for our muscles to be able to do work, using these concepts and models that we even used during Breaking2, that were these critical power models, and some of these other concepts that we know are tightly linked to the energetics in the muscle. So kind of the relationship, again, back to how are these variables influencing each other? Because I can measure these cardiovascular variables, I can measure these bioenergetics variables, and how do they influence each other? So that's the area of research that I'm trying to set up. At the same time, we go back to this idea of engineering and ultimate performance. And I use the term engineering lightly or loosely, but setting the context of a performance. And so how does heat, how does energetics, how does hydration status, all these things, how does that influence somebody's performance? So being able to apply what we learn in the lab to those kind of contextual environments. In other words, applying what we learn to help people optimize their performance, but at the same time, doing those types of endeavors or doing those types of things will allow us to ask better questions and get, all right, how are these pieces of data that we saw over here, how are they interacting to ultimately dictate how our muscles are getting energy, et cetera. So kind of playing off of each other, where we're looking at these, setting the context of these specific performance optimization questions, and allowing that to provide more specific questions that we can then go answer in the lab, and vice versa. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. So is it, we keep coming back to having all these different variables link up for an athlete. What are the most, I want to try to drill this down to the practical pieces for the everyday athlete. What are the big ones? What are the 2 or 3 things that when an athlete's looking at, okay, I want to maximize my performance for the Boston Marathon, Western States, or whatever. What are the heavy hitters to which they absolutely have to nail to focus on, those big boxes to check, or the big rocks to really focus on to maximize their performance?
Yeah, the first thing I would think that we talked about a lot is optimizing that dose response relationship for you. So when you have a specific training load, what's your response to that training load? Both the adaptation, so how does it make me better, as well as the recovery. So how long am I going to be depressed from a system standpoint after that load before I bounce back and have that adaptation, right? So how do I respond, get better, and how long does it take me to have that response? So that's going to be different for each individual. I think that's something that everybody has to nail for themselves. Because a given response for athlete A, they may in one day be back and be ready to go. Athlete B might take 3 days. That could be due to age, that could be due to training status, that could be due to genetics even, that could be due to a lot of different factors, right? So understanding both the size of that dose response relationship as well as the timing of that dose response relationship.
And it's not always 3 weeks hard, 1 week easy, which is what we see all the time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not like that for everybody. So that would be number one. The second thing, especially when you're looking at longer endurance race, I think energy and running economy questions are very important to understand. So not wasting any energy throughout those events and making sure that you are replacing that energy, or it's very hard to replace all of the energy. You just can't ingest that much, but trying to have some sort of exogenous or outside source of fuel to be able to accomplish those is another one. But so, reducing the energetic cost at the speeds that you're going to run for those distances, I think is another one that people it's kind of a low hanging fruit, like making sure you're not wearing heavy shoes or wearing heavy clothes, or, weight is one of the biggest factors that influences economy of movement. So what is your optimal even body weight when you're going to go compete? Those kinds of things I think can be pretty low hanging fruit, because, just a few, 100 or 200 milliliters of oxygen increase in oxygen cost of running can be, at the end of a long ultra, can be a couple of Big Macs worth of energy, right? Like that can be a lot. So can you reduce that as much as possible? And so that kind of dose response relationship, energy cost, reducing that as much as possible, and then making sure that you can bring in calories, I think is another big factor. So making sure that you're bringing in enough sugar, enough glucose, enough support, so that you're not burning muscle glycogen. Because as soon as you burn muscle glycogen, you're going to stop. Like, we know that the glycogen depletion is the biggest predictor of fatigue. So if you can have some sort of good exogenous source of glucose, you can prolong that depletion of glycogen. And so that would be another one. But again, that's individualized. And so people have to really kind of play with, what are you bringing in? How much are you bringing in? What sources? Is it glucose, fructose? Is it some combination? There's all different types of products out there, different combinations. So what works best for you? You can also train your gut so that you need to practice bringing this stuff in. Don't just show up on the start line and think that your body's going to be able to bring in high amounts of glucose, because it's just not. So you'll have to practice that. And so just planning that, I think those three factors are probably some of the biggest.
The sheer individual nature of the last piece is really demonstrated. You need to get in some sort of nutrition, and it's going to be different for everybody. I always think that that's really well demonstrated by the sheer variety of foodstuffs on an aid station table in the middle of an ultramarathon, because you have everything. You have fruits, you have real foods, you have junk food, you have engineered scientific foods, gels and electrolyte drink mix and things like that. You have salt tablets and pretzels and goldfish and sandwiches. And like, where else does that exist? Where else is this weird combination of food? And they'll all get taken.
Yeah. It's what people have practiced with and what works for them. I mean, and the intensities, that they're exercising at may not be as limiting as far as absorption of a lot of stuff that somebody would be, say, running a 10K or even a marathon. But yeah, they've trained their gut with those things, and they've found that it works for them. And so it's an eclectic mix, right?
Yeah, for sure. Cool. All right, we're going to leave it there. I'm going to let you go. Okay. Get back to the students.
Yeah.
Good luck. First week of school.
Second
week of school. Yeah. I feel for you guys are heroes along with our first responders and things like that, having to instruct our young people in whatever they're trying to get instructed on in this time.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we don't have to go fully remote here in a couple of weeks, but
we'll see. We'll see if the bet holds up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I really appreciate it, Jason. It was fun.
Yeah, Brad, that was excellent. Right. Appreciate it. And there we have it. Much thanks to Brad for coming on the podcast today. As I mentioned from the onset, I could have taken this podcast in a number of different directions, but I really wanted to focus on what are the actionable things that we can learn from these types of projects. Hope everybody got a lot out of this particular podcast. If you like the podcast, go ahead and go on over to Apple Podcast and give the podcast a rating or a review. Really appreciate those ratings or reviews, or you could just simply share it with a friend. That means a lot to me when you folks do that. I really appreciate the feedback that I've gotten on social media. Appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you listeners. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.